if you're lucky enough to live in a temperate climate like we do here in the UK. There are a whole host of vegetables that you can leave in the ground over winter and be harvesting all through the winter too. But I think it's really important to say that you don't have to do any of these things. There is no you must do this. I get really cross when I see on social media, you must grow this now. No, you mustn't. Do what is right for you, do what you feel like doing, and grow the plants that you know that you like to eat. Before we get any further, I'm just going to take the netting off this bed. So there's been netting on here all through the summer to reduce the chances of having cabbage white butterfly and cabbage moth land on the brassicas and lay their eggs on them. And it's also helped to reduce the chances of the local pigeons coming and eating the brassicas. Now, although the pigeons may still come and peck at them, I think they need the airflow around them and to be able to grow taller than these hoops are at the moment. In today's video, I'm going to look at some of the vegetables that you can be harvesting throughout the winter and some vegetables that you can sow the seeds of now to harvest during the winter and early next spring. I'm Liz Zorab and this is Byther Farm. So let's start off by talking about brassicas. There are a whole host of brassicas you can sow in early spring, and some you'll be harvesting by late summer, and others will sit in the ground over winter. And this is one of those. This is purple sprouting broccoli. Well, except this isn't. This is white sprouting broccoli. But I usually grow purple sprouting broccoli, which in the spring will send up flower shoots, and before the flowers open, we harvest those little florets, and that's the part that we eat. I do love them. But you can also eat the leaves. There's absolutely no reason you can't eat the leaves. If you don't have many other brassicas or you don't have much space, this is the sort of thing to grow where you actually get a dual crop from it. And around this side of the bed, I've got Brussels sprouts. Now the sprouts actually grow where the leaves join the stem. And so at the moment they are the size of a small marble, but they're coming, and so it won't be too long before we can harvest these. Certainly I'm expecting to be able to harvest some Brussels sprouts for Christmas. And I'll leave links to all the plants I've talked about in the video description and also over on my website. And if you want to have all of that information just sent straight to your inbox, make sure to sign up to my newsletter, and I'll leave links for that on the video description and on my website. Some of the other brassicas that you can grow are this, which is Asturian tree cabbage. It's a fairly short-lived perennial. We'll do 2, 3, maybe even 4 years, as long as you keep snapping off any flower heads that produced. And here is a scarlet kale. Not only is it very pretty, and I happily grow it as an ornamental in amongst my flowers, but kale is hardy. This one is really hardy, and it will cope with being outside right through the winter, and then you just come and harvest some of the leaves as and when you want them. I propagate so many plants, and I used to find it really difficult to remember which seeds I'd sown where and when I'd taken cuttings, or even where I'd planted things. And so I started keeping a journal and writing everything down. So I've now created this. It's a vegetable garden planner and journal, and there's masses of space in it for you to take notes and observations, to write down when you've sown seeds or taken cuttings, and even where you've planted them. I include a vegetable sowing guide, so that's times when you can sow various different vegetables. There's some information about perennial veg and also about composting. And all the way through, there are some hints and tips and some words of encouragement to keep you going in your garden. You can order your copy of a journal either direct on our website at bytherfarm.com or through Amazon. And here's another kale sown in the spring. It's Cavallo Nero kale, Tuscan kale or black kale. It's got plenty of names. And can you hear? It's a tough plant, but surprisingly when it's cooked, it's not tough. It's not a tough rubbery old veg. It's actually incredibly tasty. It's really very simple to grow from seed in the spring, and I recently saw in our local supermarket they were selling about 8 leaves of this organic kale, and they were charging somewhere between £2 and £3 for it. I was quite shocked when it's so simple to grow and you actually don't need a huge amount of space. There are loads of different types of kale that you can grow, both annuals and perennials. I also grow Taunton Dean and Orbenton kale, both of which are perennials, and I have them in the forest garden. But here in this bed, this is an interesting looking plant. This is actually a cauliflower. I didn't get to harvest it in time when it was a tight head, and so I just left it. And it's produced all these little shoots, which I have been assured are perfectly good for eating. They taste of cauliflower, so they absolutely taste cauliflower. I'm going to be harvesting this today. This is great. So you could use this in a stir fry or just as a side dish. I think it just needs steaming. I don't think it needs much cooking. That's really lovely. And here, next to the cauliflower, is a red cabbage. And this is one that I harvested a few weeks ago. So I cut there, but I left the plant in the ground. And now it has produced 3 or maybe 4 of these like almost mini cabbages on top. And one of those is perfect to take in and just use as a small amount of cabbage in one meal. And here's a cabbage that will sit through the winter and will produce a fairly loose head of leaves as a spring greens or a spring cabbage. Here in the polytunnel for growing over winter, I am putting some red Russian kale seeds into the ground. So I'm sowing them fairly thickly because I'm not really growing them for large plants. I'm just going to be cutting the leaves, the small leaves, as a salad crop. Parsley will stay in your garden through most of the winter, and a really good leafy green is chard. It's very hardy and you can still harvest it even when it starts going to seed. Unlike spinach, it doesn't taste bitter once it starts going to flower. And there's still plenty of time to sow things like rocket and perpetual spinach, which will grow away slowly and give you fresh, tasty leaves right through the winter. For plants in the onion family, now is the ideal time to be looking at planting lots of them. So you can buy heat-treated onion sets, which are like little baby onions, and you can plant those anytime between now and, say, the end of November. And that gives the roots a chance to start growing and to establish, and then they'll sit doing not very much during the winter, but then in the spring they'll already have their roots established and be ready to grow away very quickly, and they'll give you a harvest in July, August time-ish. And you can do the same with garlic and shallots. And you need to make sure that you've got an autumn planting variety, because there are others that you can plant in spring. Alternatively, you can grow a perennial onion, something like this Welsh bunching onion. You can see this one has gone to flower and is producing seeds, and they'll drop on the ground and produce more. But these will sit in the ground quite happily all winter. The greenery does tend to die back a bit, particularly if we have very, very cold weather, but it doesn't take very much for it to send up small shoots again, and then you can harvest these as onion greens. Alternatively, you can lift them and use the bulb, but remember, when you do that you'll need to sow more, because it's the bulb that all these leaves grow from. And then there's also some leeks here. I sowed my leeks quite late this year, but the great thing about leeks is they can be stored in the ground and just harvested when you need them throughout the winter. You can also harvest them as baby leeks if you want to. I prefer to leave them to get a bit larger than this and harvest them right through to the hungry gap, when they'll start growing again and also start trying to go to seed. And for a scallion during the winter, so that's a spring onion, a salad onion, I'm going to grow Performer, which I find performs better than White Lisbon in the cooler months. There weren't very many seeds in that little packet, so I'll pop all of those in there. And those should grow nicely through the cooler months to give me some small spring onions in a couple of months' time, and to let a few grow on for early next year. And these are parsnips, which are a root vegetable, sown somewhere between March and May. So not only are parsnips really hardy, they are actually better once they've had a frost or two, because something happens in the parsnip and the starches get acted on by the cold and they start turning to sugars, which makes your parsnip even sweeter. So although you can harvest them now, and they're plenty big enough, these ones, to harvest now, they're going to taste better after the first frost or two. In the UK, they can be left in the ground all winter, and you can just carry on harvesting them as you need them throughout the winter months and into spring. If you sowed carrots earlier in the year, you can leave those in the ground, but it's worth remembering it has been so wet and rainy this year that we've probably got a huge number of slugs, and they could be susceptible to slug damage. I'm going to be sowing carrots in a container, which I'm going to suspend from one of the bars in the polytunnel to keep it up off the ground, and unless the slugs can climb up the polytunnel and then sort of drop down from the top, I think, I hope, we should be fine with them being there. And then in the new year I'll be sowing some fairly short carrots, something like red call chantenay or a globe carrot, or even an Amsterdam forcing carrot, and I'll be putting those in the polytunnel to give me a very early harvest at the end of spring and into early summer. Remember, carrots don't need to be enormous to harvest them. You can still use them when they're really quite small. Baby carrots are absolutely delicious. Now, I've just weeded this space a bit so I can show you what's here. These are some beetroot sown sort of midsummer, multi-sown into modules and then planted out underneath the brassicas while the brassicas were still much smaller. Other root vegetables that you've grown earlier in the year, like celeriac, can also be stored in the ground for a while, but I do find that the slugs and also the wood lice will find them before we get out the other side of Christmas, so I try and harvest those in the first month or so of winter. Now, in your polytunnel, greenhouse, or even your cold frame, you can continue to grow things like turnips and radishes, and in fact you can grow a French breakfast radish right through the year. It's going to grow much more slowly as the weather cools down, but it will still keep growing. And this really attractive leaf plant is Oca, spelt O-C-A, and it's a small tuber that comes from the Andes, and it's got a slightly lemony, appley taste. I now grow it purely as ground cover because I love the shape of the leaves, but this can be harvested after the first frosts and probably something like the first or second week in December, so very early in winter. But then you take the tubers inside and cure them and use them throughout the winter. Another really interesting root vegetable to explore is Hamburg parsley, or root parsley. Now, I haven't grown any recently because I've forgotten all about it, but I did try it a few years ago. Hamburg parsley. So this has been used all summer long for the lovely parsley growth on the top, and now we're starting to use the roots as a root vegetable. So a little bit gnarly, and I actually planted them in clumps, so this has got 2, 3 together. They've grown, twisted together. That's fine, I have no problem with that. I can wash it and peel them, and again I'm using these like a parsnip or a carrot as a root vegetable, and they are great in trays of roaster, in stews, cows. I'm really enjoying the taste of them. It's not carroty, it's not parsnippy, but it doesn't taste really strongly of parsley either. I did promise you I would try and explain what they taste like. The answer is pretty good. Now, these towering giants behind me, and I haven't done any trick photography here, these are Jerusalem artichokes. So they are knobbly, tuberous, very fibrous veg that grow just under the ground, and they can be harvested in early winter. Now, I know some people really struggle with digesting them, but if you boil them thoroughly first and then slow roast them, you'll be breaking down some of those fibres and those substances that we find so difficult to digest, and they'll have less of an impact in terms of wind. And these are also Jerusalem artichokes, but these are a dwarf variety. And in fact, the variety is called dwarf. And this dwarf variety, which really only gets to about 90 or maybe 100 centimetres, so that's around 3 feet. On our very windy site, these don't take such a battering. They have less tendency to flop over. And they're giving me a really good harvest from quite a small space. Now they do spread out, but I'm growing in raised beds, so they aren't going to be able to go beyond the raised beds. And another way to confine them is to grow them in a tub. Between now and the end of autumn, so end of November, it's a really good time to be sowing broad beans and also field beans, which you can use as a cover crop. They'll quietly grow on through the winter and keep that microbial action going on in the soil. You can harvest the tops like greens and they'll just taste of beans, and then you can also harvest the beans when they come next spring and going into the summer. Choose a variety that is suitable for overwintering, so for broad bean try Aquadulce Claudia, and there are a host of field beans that are really good for overwintering. Again, I'll leave links in the video description and on my website. And there are also peas that you can sow now that will quietly grow on through the winter. Try a variety like Meteor. Winter squash, as their name implies, can be eaten throughout the winter as long as they have been prepared and stored properly. So here in the polytunnel this year, I've grown some butternut squash. I'm picking this one up and showing to you because it's the biggest one I've got. But I will know that this is ready to harvest when the little stem that joins the squash onto the main vine, when that turns brown or discolours or goes pale, when all of it is that colour, I'll know that this is absolutely ready to harvest. Now I could harvest it now, but either way, what I need to make sure I do is cut a bit of the vine so that there is the stem that goes into the squash and a little bit of the vine each side, because when they shrink back, we don't want to leave the actual squash vulnerable to infection. And then this needs to be left in a warm, dry place, but with plenty of airflow. So under a veranda or a porch, in a polytunnel or greenhouse, as long as the door is open and there is plenty of air flowing around. And you want to leave it until when you press your thumbnail gently onto the skin, it doesn't make an indentation. Be really careful not to push it right in and damage the fruit, vegetable, while you're checking. But once that's hard, then it can be stored in your house in a cool room that is dry, so somewhere like a spare bedroom. And rhubarb is another vegetable, yes, it's classed as a vegetable, that stays in the ground over winter and is very happy. If you have a variety like Timperley Early, which is very early, this can start regrowing in late December, in January, and you'll see new shoots coming up. Force it by putting either a pot or a barrel or a specific rhubarb forcer over it. The stems will come up and they'll be blanched as they grow, and when you then harvest them, they'll be incredibly sweet, almost white, slightly pink. I don't force my rhubarb because I have several different varieties. Timperley Early I can be harvesting very easily from March onwards, so it's another good one to have in the garden over winter to give you a really nice early crop next year. And whatever you choose to grow in your garden through the winter, I hope you enjoy it and that you'll have fun. And if you want to know what you can sow in October, well, I've made a video and I'll leave a link on the screen and in the video description.